Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by author Matthew Desmond. We are about a third of the way through the 23rd chapter, which is entitled The Serenity Club. I want to ask people to please share this link, whether you share it on Instagram, whether you share it on Facebook, whether you share it on Twitter, whether you inbox it to some people, whatever you can share it on, please share it. Reminder that we put these episodes out on Anchor, on Pocket Cast, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on YouTube, also on Facebook and on SoundCloud. So any of those platforms you can listen to these Rockford Reading Daily episodes on. I want to encourage people to please listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily. And if by the time you get a hold of this, there are future episodes out, please listen to those future episodes. We are just about done with Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And this book has been very informative for me personally. And it falls right in line with the books of The Color of Law, Citizens, Cops, and Power, and High Risers, and just articulating some of the specific issues that people in poverty deal with when it comes to housing, when it comes to being evicted, when it comes to looking for housing, when it comes to homeless shelters, and all of the moving pieces that are around those things. And for me and for us in the May 30th Alliance, what our job to do is finding how to situate that experience into the overall story about the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I think one of the things I like to say too before we dive in is this is a very helpful thing for me. I know that other people listen to this, and hopefully people do listen to this and they learn and they gain information from it. But for me as well, this is a way for me to be able to read. I try to do usually a couple hours a day, have pre-recorded episodes, pre-published episodes, and just have them dropping every day at 8 o'clock a.m. But for me, it does the job of I gain more information. I then also get the ability or the opportunity to immediately after gaining the information, find a way to articulate that information in my own words and from my own perspective. And then also I get better at being able to uh, communicate thoughts that I have, communicate experiences that I have, get more comfortable with communicating. And so this is a very beneficial thing for me too. So I want to thank the people who listen for giving me the opportunity to learn as I go through these Rockford Reading Daily episodes. And I hope that that's something that stands out as well as people are listening. Okay, we are on page 274 of Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Let's dive in. At 7:37 a.m., Scott signed into the Milwaukee County Behavioral Services Division Access Clinic. The clinic served residents with no insurance or only GAMP, Milwaukee County's public insurance. A sign on the wall announced, "Your first appointment may last 3 to 5 hours. If you didn't have the money, you would pay with your time." Nurses and social workers bustled past patients strolling the hallways, doing nothing while they waited. Scott wouldn't mind working at the clinic, being one of the fast walkers. But on that day, he was there for drugs. To him, what the AA converts didn't understand, because none of them were heroin users, was that his body was physically in need of something that would give him a boost and kickstart his motivation. His fingers were crossed for Suboxone. His fingers were crossed for Suboxone, which was used to treat opiate addiction. After almost 3 hours, Scott's name was called. He stood up, relieved to be seen. The psychiatrist was a skinny Asian man with a flat top and a voice just above a whisper. He led Scott into a drab, rectangular room that resembled an oversized closet. Scott sat on a couch, and the psychiatrist bent over an old desk, reading Scott's file. The desk was pushed against the wall so that when Scott looked up from the couch, he saw the psychiatrist in profile. Quote, "How long have you been depressed?" End quote, the psychiatrist asked, staring at the file. Quote, "A long time," end quote, Scott answered. Quote, "So, what kind of symptoms are you having?" End quote. Quote, "I just don't have no energy. I'm thinking about looking into Suboxone. I can't tell if I'm in post-withdrawal," end quote. Quote, how long have you had trouble with drugs? End quote. Quote, I'd say about 7 years, end quote. Quote, and how long have you been clean? End quote. Quote, 4 months, end quote. After Scott filled him in about his drug use, the psychiatrist paused before the next question. Quote, end quote, he continued, quote, it says here that you were sexually abused when you were younger, end quote. Quote, correct, end quote, Scott sniffed. Quote, how old were you? End quote. Quote, young. From 4 to, end quote, Scott thought for a moment. Quote, 10, end quote. Quote, who was the perpetrator? End quote. Scott told him. Quote, so how did it end? Was someone told? End quote. Quote, no, I never told anybody about it. End quote. Quote, have you ever gotten any treatment for that? End quote. Quote, no. End quote. Quote, you have any interest in that? End quote. Quote, no. End quote. Scott walked out of the clinic with 2 bottles of antidepressants. He was to take 100 milligrams of Zoloft twice a day and 50 milligrams of amitriptyline at bedtime. When Scott had asked, quote, do you suggest anything to help with the cravings, end quote, the doctor had mentioned treatment programs instead of Suboxone. Scott had been, quote, a little bummed, end quote, at that response. But 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. It was cold outside, -1 degrees without the windshield. Under Scott's boots, the snow squeaked. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's have a reflection. So, one of the other themes that we've seen reoccurring throughout this piece of writing is people who have been sexually assaulted. And we've seen it happen with men and with women, and or with young boys and with young girls. And I think that's another one of the things that until you begin to read about some of these circumstances and some of these people's experiences, you don't realize how many commonalities there are when it comes to some of these symptoms or some of the residual effects of poverty and of oppression and of exploitation. And one of the ones of poverty is sexual violence, is people being sexually assaulted, is people not having proper or adequate outlets to try to receive treatment for that sexual violence. And I think that, and one of the things that happens as you keep reading through these things is you begin to get a grim understanding of what reality and what society is really like, as opposed to having a romanticized one that you can get sometimes through your own experiences or through entertainment. And it's very disheartening to hear about how many children have been sexually assaulted, sexually violated. And then the ways that manifest in their lives as they become adults. 3 months later, while rooting around for loose change, David and Anna Aldea's 12-year-old daughter found a syringe in Scott's swimming trunks. Oscar, the Aldea's eldest son, who had recently moved back home, floated the possibility of it being an old needle, which was entirely plausible. When Scott had first moved in, he would periodically find paraphernalia in the pocket of a sweatshirt or a pair of jeans he hadn't worn in a while. He even found a crack pipe once, looking at it and remembering, the way you do when finding a faded ticket stub in the laundry. But David and Anna weren't buying it. That night, after Scott had finished cleaning the Serenity Club, he discovered his things on the Aldea's porch with a note. He tried the door, locked. Theirs had been his home for 7 months. Scott didn't plead his case. He shunned confrontation, and David and Anna wouldn't have believed him anyway. Quote, it's much easier for them to think that it was mine than his, end quote, Scott reflected. Besides, this was no time for Oscar to detox, having just become a father. The unselfish thing to do, in Scott's mind, was to allow Oscar to keep using so that he could be there for his girlfriend and baby daughter. Scott knew the needle was Oscar's because Scott had shot up with him. Scott wouldn't use the term, quote, relapse, end quote. He would say, quote, it just made me normal, end quote. Several things had happened all at once. First, Scott learned that all those AA meetings he had sat through and all those group therapy sessions, which he hated even more, didn't count toward his nursing license. The nursing board had its own procedure, and Scott hadn't followed it. The board also had its own lab for urine screening, and since Scott hadn't used it at all those clean drops he'd been racking up didn't count either. Quote, I went and pissed in the cup, and I did that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally, I contacted the board to make sure that it was all okay, and they were like, no, end quote. Just days after hearing this defeat, Scott ran into Heroin Susie and Billy at a gas station. They offered, and he accepted, a quiet act of rebellion. That might have been an isolated incident, a small backslip on his steep climb. But then Oscar moved in with a full-blown habit. The two began getting high on the weekends together. Scott would stop using by Monday so that he could piss clean on Friday. He was still going to counseling and AA meetings, but after a few months, he dropped the routine and started getting high whenever he could. At 2 a.m., standing on the porch of the Aldia recovery house with the sack of clothes in his memory box, Scott took the natural next step and called Susie and Billy. He spent that night in their trailer, right back where he started. A few days later, as Susie baked an apple pie, Scott called his mom, Joan. He had decided to give methadone a try and needed two things: heroin in his system, which he had, and $150, which he didn't. A month earlier, Scott had returned to his hometown for a 2-day visit. He stayed at his mother's small but dignified home, visited his grandmother in the nursing home, played video games with his teenage nieces, and watched his sister model her new wedding dress. It had been 2 years since Scott had seen his mother. Quote, I would drive up to see you if I could drive in the city, end quote. Joan apologized without apologizing. The visit had been pleasant. Scott was relaxed and calm, not like his last visit, when he seemed to Joan as nervous as a caged rabbit. Quote, his legs would be shaking a mile a minute, end quote, she remembered. Joan had organized a special lunch and a big dinner so that all the relatives could see Scott. He traveled back to Milwaukee feeling loved, and that memory helped him pick up the phone. Quote, it's a methadone clinic, end quote, Scott was saying. Do you know what that is? I'll go to them every day to get the medication, and that'll help me with the opiate addiction and depression. I've kind of tried to do all this and beat this without. I didn't want you to really know the whole, but it's not working that way, end quote. Scott drew a breath. Quote, Mom, does that make sense to you? End quote. All Joan knew was that her son, who almost never asked for anything, was asking for help. She came up with $150. The next morning, Scott sat in the 10th Street Methadone Clinic, waiting his turn. The clinic had 4 stations. Reception took your money, and collections took your piss. The nurses greeted regulars by their nicknames or numbers. Quote, hey, Dino, end quote. Quote, your lucky day, 3322, end quote. The third station was the bathroom, equipped with a camera to make sure you weren't swapping urine. At the last station, the methadone dispenser sat behind a thick door on which someone had clipped an article from The Onion with the headline, Everything Taking Too Long, accompanied by a photograph of a man staring impatiently at a microwave. Once buzzed in, patients stepped through the door and punched their number into a dispenser, which would squirt the bitter red liquid into a small plastic cup. Scott thought the most diverse place in all of Milwaukee had to be the methadone clinic at 7 a.m. Through its doors had walked a 20-something white woman in full makeup carrying a designer purse, a grunting Mexican man leaning on a walker, a white woman holding a newborn, a tall black man with earrings whom Scott enjoyed looking at, a fat painter, a burly construction worker, a white woman in pressed slacks and a pink blouse, and a man in an accountant suit. When a bent-over Chinese woman who looked to be in her 80s shuffled into the clinic, a Puerto Rican woman with a cane walked over and hugged her. Quote, You knew? End quote, someone asked. Scott turned around to find a young white woman who looked like she belonged on the East High School track team. She was maybe 18 with a ponytail, freckles, orthodontic straightened teeth. Scott nodded yes. Quote, well, my advice, end quote, the girl scooted closer, quote, is don't get on this stuff. I mean, they say they want you to get in or get you off, but it's all a lie. They just want your money. I've been on this for who knows how long, and I'm still taking 100 milligrams, end quote. Scott raised his eyebrows, recalling that 100 milligrams was the dose that had sent him to the hospital the last time he had tried methadone. As he remembered it, he had mixed the dose with Xanax and succumbed to the cocktail soon after leaving the clinic, stumbling into oncoming traffic. The responding officer injected him with Narcan, sending him into a convulsive withdrawal that landed him in the ICU. Quote, how much do you pay? End quote, Scott asked. Quote, 370, end quote, she answered, referencing her monthly bill. He nodded and wondered how he would make the next installment. When it was Scott's turn, he swallowed the red stuff, swished a little water in the cup, and downed the rinse. Those last drops could make a difference. Before he left, Scott met with the methadone counselor, a black man around Scott's age. Quote, how many times in the last 30 days have you used heroin? End quote, the counselor asked. Quote, 30, end quote. Scott went on to tell the counselor about his mother lending him the $150. Quote, I guess it's my fault for underestimating her, end quote, he said. Quote, maybe I just cut her out of everything, end quote. Quote, you're as sick as your secrets, end quote, the counselor said. Because he couldn't afford both methadone and rent on his Serenity Club check, Scott went homeless. He checked into an 86-bed shelter called the Guest House. Every morning, he bussed to the methadone clinic, and every evening, he slept on a bunk bed in a large room with other homeless men. Methadone made him sweat and gain weight, and it smothered his libido, but it worked. Most people who began methadone treatment dropped out within a year. Scott stuck with it. Over time, he became a resident manager at the guest house and started helping people again. 4 days a week, Scott worked in one of the guest house's satellite shelters, an unmarked 3-story home with bay windows tucked in the quiet Southside neighborhood. He scrubbed bathrooms with bleach and guided old-timers to the backyard picnic table, where they sat and tapped their cigarette ash into a repurposed Folgers coffee can. A year and almost $4,700 later, the county agreed to help Scott pay for his methadone, lowering his monthly bill to $35. Then, through a permanent housing program offered by the guest house, Scott was able to move into his own place, paying 1/3 of his income to rent. He chose the majestic loft apartments on Wisconsin Avenue, right next to the Grand Avenue Mall. He had always wanted to live downtown and had been a regular at the mall after first arriving in Milwaukee. Back then, to an Iowa farm kid at least, the mall was a vibrant social scene. The 14-story Majestic was built in 1908, originally for offices and a vaudeville theater. After it was converted into residential apartments, developers installed a fitness center, an indoor basketball court, a small private movie theater, and a putting green with artificial turf. Scott's apartment was on the 10th floor. It had clean, wheat-colored carpet, unblemished white walls, many blinds over person-length windows, a generous bathroom, and a working stove and refrigerator. The guest house furnished the apartment with the dark brown love seat and matching couch, a few lamps Scott preserved by leaving the plastic wrapping on the shades, and a full-size bed that Scott hardly used. Falling asleep on the couch had become a habit. There was even a stacked washer and dryer. It felt too good to be true. At first, Scott half believed that the guest house would call and say they made a mistake. The apartment rented for $775 a month. Scott only paid $141. It took a good month before Scott was able to accept the apartment as his own. Once he did, he acquired a bathroom rug, a navy blue coverlet, hand soap, scented candles, throw pillows, mouthwash, dishes, and a welcome mat on which to place his shoes. The apartment made Scott feel affirmed, deserving of something better. It motivated him. One day, Scott used a magnet from the Society of St. Vincent de Paul to stick a note on his refrigerator. It read, 5-year plan. Back to nursing, make a lot more money, live as cheaply as possible, start a savings account. 2 years and 3 months after losing his license, Scott was finally able to start scrimping for the lab test he would need to become a nurse again. He even started collecting loose change for this purpose, keeping the coins in the kitchen jar. In the trailer park, Scott had felt stuck. Quote, I just didn't know how to fix anything, end quote, he remembered. Quote, it felt like the end of the earth down there, like none of the rest of the city existed, end quote. During that time, Scott often thought about killing himself. He'd have done it with a monster hit of heroin, but he never could find enough money. Scott's new place was such a stark contrast to his trailer and everything it represented that he began to think back on his time in the park as, quote, one big camping trip, end quote, removed from civilization. Sometimes, when he remembered those days and all he had lost, he would leave his apartment and wind his way through the Majestic's narrow, dimly lit hallways and come to a door. He'd open it and emerge in the middle of the Grand Avenue Mall as if stepping through a secret passageway. Walking the mall's floors, Scott would take in the lights, music, food smells, and people, and remember how he used to feel years ago when the city was still full of wonder and promise. And then that brings us to the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 24, which is entitled Can't Win for Losing. And I believe that is our final chapter. Yes, we have one chapter left, which we will knock out in this entirety in the next episode. And then we will be finished with Evict. Actually, we'll read the epilogue. I think that's the think that's the next chapter after that. We got an epilogue in here. Let me see. Yeah, we'll read the epilogue. So we got 2 chapters left, probably 2 episodes left, maybe 3 at most. And my biggest takeaways from the episode that we just went through, the passages we just read, are just the importance of continuing on, the importance of continuing to struggle, the importance of continuing to put a foot forward. And I'm too informed about the realities of the world we live in to say that for everybody that's going to work. There will be some people who won't have the opportunity to keep going forward. There will be some people whose traumas and whose baggage and whose environment will be too much of a hurdle for them to keep moving forward. But for those of us who may be able to, those of us who can overcome, the most important thing is to continue to move forward, to continue to push forward, to learn about why we are in some of the positions we're in. I think far too often we don't take the time to learn about why we are experiencing the things we're experiencing and learn about other people who are experiencing similar things. So that way, once we have come through whatever it is that we're going through, we can have the tools needed to help other people who are going through those things. And all of those things are some of the thoughts I have after reading that chapter that we just got through. And so I would encourage people to please share this on whatever platform that you're listening to it on, as I said at the beginning of the episode. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I'll holler at you tomorrow.